When winter comes to the Appalachian Mountains, survival is about more than just keeping warm, it's about outsmarting the cold. One mountaineer's ingenious, simple fire trick would heat his cabin for 40 days straight, turning the harshest season into a fight for life and legacy. Before we dive into this remarkable story, tell us where you're watching from. And if stories like this spark your curiosity, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode holds even more unbelievable survival secrets. The cold winds howled through the narrow gaps of the cabin, clawing at the doorframe and rattling the wooden walls. Deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where the peaks seemed to touch the sky and the valleys were wrapped in silence, winter had arrived with a vengeance. The snow had fallen thick, painting the landscape white, and the bitter chill seeped through every crack. For most men, this was the moment to huddle by the fire, waiting for the thaw. But, for one mountaineer, the season ahead was about to test the limits of ingenuity. Ezra Cole, a man hardened by decades of living off the land, had never feared the winter. He understood it as a challenge, one that demanded respect but could be outwitted. His cabin was modest, built with his own two hands. It wasn't the kind of structure that would stand out among the many makeshift homes dotting the Appalachian ridges. A small stone fireplace sat in one corner, its chimney curling upward like a snake seeking warmth. On most days, the fire would roar, filling the cabin with the comforting scent of oak and pine. But Ezra knew that the fire alone would never last long enough to fend off the relentless cold. In this isolated world, where survival was dictated by the elements, nothing was taken for granted. Food, warmth, and shelter, all were precious, fleeting commodities. Ezra had seen men die in the wilderness for less. A momentary lapse in preparation could mean the end. But Ezra was different. He had an uncanny way of seeing the world through the lens of survival, understanding the laws of nature in a way that others could not. And so, in the dead of winter, when his hands were blistered from chopping wood and the sky had turned to a colorless gray, Ezra began crafting a solution, one that would change everything. The solution wasn't a newfangled tool, nor was it a revolutionary technique learned from books. No, Ezra's trick was simple. It was a return to the basics, a method honed over generations, but refined in the quiet of his solitude. He'd seen other mountaineers struggle with their fireplaces, constantly stoking the flames and adding logs, only to see their efforts consumed in minutes. Ezra's trick would make the fire burn slower, longer, and more efficiently. But it was not only the trick itself that fascinated Ezra. It was what it represented a shift in how he viewed the world around him. For a man like him, whose hands were calloused and whose life had been carved from the earth, this trick was more than just a way to heat his cabin. It was a testament to his ability to adapt, to survive, to turn what others saw as a fight into a careful dance with the elements. As Ezra sat in front of his hearth, his gaze fixed on the flames as they crackled and danced, he knew that what he had created wasn't just a trick, it was the key to his winter survival. The warmth that now radiated from the fire wasn't just a fleeting comfort, it was a lasting heat, an endurance, something that would not falter at the first sign of the cold wind. For most, the cold was an enemy, a relentless force that demanded constant battle. But Ezra, in his quiet wisdom, had learned to make peace with it. He had spent years observing the behavior of the land, learning its rhythms, understanding its silent language. And now, in the dead of winter, he would apply that knowledge to create something simple, something so elegantly effective that it seemed almost too easy. He had noticed, in his countless winters spent alone, that the way heat moved in the cabin was far more predictable than many realized. The air, thick with the scent of burning wood, would rise from the hearth and cling to the ceiling, eventually escaping through the chimney. The heat, while intense near the fire, would dissipate too quickly, leaving the rest of the cabin to suffer the biting cold. Ezra's solution, at its core, was about control. By carefully adjusting the positioning of the logs, the type of wood he used, and the airflow within the cabin, he could stretch the warmth of the fire, making it last longer and burn more efficiently. He didn't need to stoke the flames constantly. The fire did the work itself. This wasn't about creating a roaring blaze, but rather about sustaining a steady, lasting warmth. He began stacking his wood differently, aligning the logs in a specific way that allowed the fire to burn more slowly. The key was the arrangement, not too close, but not too far apart either. The air needed to flow just right. Too little air and the fire would smolder. Too much and it would burn itself out. Ezra had found the balance. Every night he would sit by the hearth watching the fire burn. It was a soothing ritual, one that calmed his mind after a long day of work. And with each passing day, as the snow piled higher outside, Ezra knew that his cabin, his haven, would remain warm. For 40 days straight, he would not have to worry about the cold creeping in. The fire would burn, slow and steady, providing him with the warmth he so desperately needed. In those long, solitary evenings, Ezra thought about the other men in the valley, struggling to keep their own homes warm. He knew that many of them would rely on the same methods they always had, constantly tending to their fires, fighting the cold with every log they could muster. But Ezra had learned that survival didn't come from brute force. It came from understanding, from adapting, from thinking differently. And as the fire continued to burn, the nights grew colder and the snow continued to fall, Ezra Cole's simple fire trick proved to be more than just a clever way to keep his cabin warm. It was the key to his survival. By the end of December, the snow had thickened, turning the mountain paths into treacherous trails of ice and powder. Ezra sat in his cabin, watching the storm rage outside, knowing that the cold was coming, a brutal cold that could drain the life out of any man who wasn't prepared. It was a test, and he was ready for it. The cabin was quiet now, the fire crackling softly in the corner. The walls, thick with cedar logs, held the warmth inside like a protective shell. The trick he had devised was working. The fire burned low and steady, not the roaring blaze that most would expect, but a quiet, controlled flame that radiated heat without waste. The warmth seemed to hug the cabin, permeating the air in every corner, yet without a burning intensity that would suck the life out of the firewood in a few hours. It was a slow burn, a long-lasting heat, and for the first time in his life, Ezra felt confident that he had mastered the mountain's harshest challenge. Ezra hadn't just spent the last few years learning how to trap, hunt, and build. He had learned how to survive the winter itself. He'd seen the devastation the cold could bring to men who weren't prepared, men who relied on brute force to stave off nature's fury. But Ezra, in his quiet wisdom, had understood that survival wasn't about fighting the elements, it was about working with them. He tested the limits of his fire trick that night. He piled the logs higher than usual, watched as the flames spread, then dimmed. He waited for the inevitable collapse of heat that always followed in past winters, but it didn't come. The fire remained steady. He stayed up late, watching the flames as they flickered and flared, but never weakened. Morning came, and with it, the biting chill of the outside world. Ezra opened the door, peering out into the white expanse. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered, biting at his skin like 1,000 needles. Yet inside the cabin, he could feel nothing but warmth. The trick was working, and Ezra knew this was just the beginning. The next test would be the real challenge. How long could the fire last without his constant attention? How long could he keep the cabin warm on just a few logs? With the storm past, Ezra's thoughts turned to the rest of the valley. He knew that most men, unable to control the fire so efficiently, would be out chopping wood at all hours, desperate to keep their cabins warm. He wondered how many of them would make it through the rest of the winter. But Ezra wasn't just thinking about survival. He was thinking about legacy. He had no desire to boast or make a name for himself. But if he could share this fire trick, this simple solution, it would change the way people survived the brutal winters of the Appalachians. His cabin might be the only place with a fire that burned this steady, but it wouldn't be for long. The cold would test everyone this year, but Ezra felt ready. For the first time in years, he had no fear of the long winter months. A few days after the storm cleared, Ezra was out in the woods, cutting fresh wood to replenish his supplies. The air was crisp and clean, the kind of cold that burned the lungs with every breath, but didn't cut into your bones if you kept moving. He worked in silence, his saw biting into the thick trunks of the oak and chestnut trees that grew near his cabin. Each cut was deliberate, measured. He wasn't in a hurry. The slower he worked, the more he could control his output. The cold didn't bother him much anymore. He had the warmth of his cabin, and that was enough. But as he worked, Ezra began to sense something, a faint rustling in the trees. He paused, hand on the saw, listening. The snow was still thick on the ground, and the path leading back to his cabin was well worn. No one should have been out here. Not in these conditions. The sound grew louder, unmistakable now. Footsteps, then voices. His heart quickened. He had always kept to himself. The mountains were vast and lonely, and he liked it that way. Strangers were a rarity in the Appalachian wilderness, and he wasn't one to welcome company. Not unless it was necessary. Ezra carefully set the saw down and picked up his rifle. He didn't need to load it. The sight of it was enough to deter most folks from getting too close. But as the voices grew clearer, Ezra's unease turned into curiosity. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about this moment was different. The strangers emerged from the tree line, 2 men and a woman, each looking exhausted and disheveled. The woman's face was pale, her cheeks flushed from the cold, while the men were gaunt, their eyes hollow. They moved cautiously, eyes scanning the woods, but their attention shifted when they saw Ezra standing at the edge of the clearing. "Well, I'll be," one of the men said with a slow drawl, "a mountain man, out here in the wilds. Haven't seen one of your kind in a while." Ezra lowered the rifle but didn't smile. "You're far from any settlement," he said, his voice low and measured. "We've been walking for days," the woman replied. "We lost our cabin to the storm. Thought we could find shelter here just for a night." Ezra studied them. They didn't look like trappers. They were too worn, too cold. They had probably been wandering for longer than they cared to admit. The mountains were unforgiving, especially in the winter. "I don't have much," Ezra said. "But you can come inside, get warm. Don't expect it to be more than a few hours before the cold comes back." The woman nodded gratefully, and the 2 men stepped forward, following her. Ezra led them back to his cabin, the heavy wood of the door creaking as he opened it to let them in. As the door closed behind them, Ezra couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety. He wasn't used to company. He wasn't sure he was ready to share the trick that had kept him warm all winter. But as the strangers huddled near the fire, their faces lighting up with the warmth that Ezra had mastered, he realized it didn't matter. In the end, this wasn't just about survival for him anymore. It was about sharing something that could change the way others lived, a simple, quiet trick that could heat a cabin for days. As the fire crackled and the night closed in around them, Ezra felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Hope. The days passed slowly, and the cabin filled with the warmth of the fire and the quiet conversation of the strangers. Ezra watched them from the corner of the room, his thoughts drifting between caution and curiosity. They weren't the typical mountain folk he had encountered before. The woman, Clara, had a certain grace to her, despite the harshness of the mountain life. Her eyes sparkled with an energy that Ezra hadn't seen in a long while, and there was a quiet resilience about her. The men, Jacob and Thomas, looked worn, their faces thin from hunger and the struggle of surviving in the wilderness without proper shelter. As the days went by, Ezra found himself sharing more than he ever had with anyone. The small acts of kindness, offering them food, a blanket, and the warmth of his fire were things he had done before, but this time felt different. There was an unspoken bond forming between them, one of shared survival and necessity. The strangers weren't there by choice, but by circumstance, and their plight stirred something in Ezra. He had always believed that isolation was the answer to surviving the harsh wilderness, but in their presence, he began to question if perhaps there was more to life than just surviving. One evening, after a hearty meal of venison stew, Clara approached him, a hesitant look in her eyes. "Ezra," she began, her voice soft, "you've been kind to us, offering shelter and warmth when you didn't have to. But there's something about this fire, something that's different. It's like the warmth here never fades, even through the coldest nights. What do you call this method?" Ezra sat back in his chair, the firelight casting long shadows across his face. He had grown accustomed to the warmth of the cabin, and the trick he had devised had become second nature to him. But now, as he looked at Clara and the 2 men beside her, he realized that what he had created was something more than just a fire technique. It was a way to endure, a gift to be passed on. "It's nothing special," he said quietly. "Just a way to make the fire last longer. I've seen men struggle with fires all my life, so I just figured it out. I arrange the logs in a way that slows the burn. Less waste, more warmth. It keeps the cold at bay for longer. Clara's eyes widened with understanding. It's genius, she whispered. In a place like this, where the weather can kill you, this could save so many people. Ezra looked at her, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face. He had never thought of his technique in those terms. To him, it was just survival, just a practical solution to a constant problem. But Clara's words resonated deep within him. She was right. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something greater, something that could change the way people lived in the wilderness. Maybe, Ezra said slowly. Maybe I could show you how it's done. It's not hard, but it takes patience. You have to understand the wood, the air, the fire itself. Once you get it right, you'll never have to worry about the cold again. Clara smiled, her face lighting up with a warmth that matched the fire before them. Please, teach us. We'll need it, if we're going to survive out here. Ezra hesitated, but only for a moment. He had never shared his secret with anyone before. But now, with Clara's pleading eyes and the trust of the men who had followed her here, he realized that survival was more than just a solitary struggle. It was a community, a shared effort. And if he could help them survive, maybe, just maybe, he would start to understand the value of connection once again. That night, as the wind howled outside and the snow began to fall again, Ezra began to teach them. He showed them how to select the right wood, how to arrange the logs in just the right way, and how to control the fire's heat so that it could last for days. As they worked together, something began to change within Ezra. For the first time in a long while, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't expected: hope. As winter pressed on, the days grew shorter, and the snow continued to fall with a relentless ferocity. Ezra had taught Clara, Jacob, and Thomas everything he knew about his fire trick. Each day, they practiced together, carefully arranging the logs, adjusting the airflow, and learning the subtle nuances of keeping a fire alive for days on end. It wasn't easy, and there were times when the fire sputtered out or burned too quickly, but with Ezra's guidance, they grew more proficient. Slowly, they began to build their confidence and their trust in the fire. But one cold afternoon in early February, a new test arrived, one that neither Ezra nor the strangers could have prepared for. The wind had shifted, blowing in from the west, and with it came a blizzard. It started off quietly, almost imperceptibly, with a thin layer of snow falling like powdered sugar. But as the hours passed, the storm grew stronger, the winds howling and the snow swirling in blinding gusts. Ezra could hear the howl of the wind battering against the walls of his cabin, but it was nothing compared to the silence that followed. For a moment, there was only the sound of the fire crackling. Then, it happened. The roof, weighed down by the thick snow, creaked ominously. Ezra's eyes widened as he saw the first few inches of snow fall from the ceiling, a sign that the structure could no longer hold the weight. The logs groaned, and the chimney shook. "Get back from the walls!" Ezra shouted, his voice filled with urgency. The others scrambled to their feet, eyes wide with fear as they saw the cabin begin to tremble. The storm was no ordinary one. This was the kind of weather that could destroy everything in its path, and the cabin wasn't built to withstand the weight of so much snow. Ezra knew they had only one chance: the fire. They needed to keep it alive long enough to stay warm while they made sure the roof wouldn't collapse entirely. The four of them worked quickly, shoveling snow away from the door to prevent it from freezing shut and reinforcing the chimney as best they could. But even with their efforts, Ezra's mind raced. The storm had come out of nowhere, and the fire, the one thing that had kept them alive until now, was beginning to dwindle. As the wind screamed outside and the storm intensified, Ezra felt the full weight of the test. If they couldn't keep the fire alive, they would have to abandon the cabin, and the storm would swallow them whole. "Stay focused," Ezra ordered, his voice calm but forceful. "We're not giving up. We keep that fire going. It's the key to our survival." The night stretched on, but Ezra refused to let the fire die. He arranged the logs once more, slowly and deliberately, using every bit of his knowledge and intuition. The others watched in silence, knowing that their lives depended on this moment. And then, as the storm raged on, the fire began to burn brighter, stronger. It was working again. They were going to make it. The storm would pass, but they would endure, together. By the time the storm subsided, the world outside was unrecognizable. The snow had piled so high against the cabin that the doorway was nearly blocked, and the wind had left its mark in the form of icy sheets on every window. Ezra stepped outside first, his boots crunching through the deep snow. The air was crisp, the storm's fury now just a whisper, leaving behind a strange quiet that seemed to settle over the land. As he surveyed the damage, his heart sank. The roof had held up better than he expected, but the weight of the snow had left its mark. There were cracks in the structure, and parts of the chimney had collapsed. It wasn't an immediate danger, but it was clear that repairs would be needed, and soon. But in that moment, the most important thing Ezra could think about was the fire. He returned to the cabin and found Clara, Jacob, and Thomas huddled by the hearth, their faces still pale from the ordeal. Ezra smiled faintly, relieved. The fire was still going, low but steady, radiating warmth through the cold air. He had taught them well. "Well, we made it," he said softly. Clara looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. "How did you know it would last?" Ezra shrugged, his eyes scanning the cabin. "It's not about knowing, it's about understanding how the world works. The storm came, but so did the fire. You just have to keep it alive, even when it seems like everything's trying to put it out." There was silence. Then Thomas spoke up. "You saved us, Ezra. If it weren't for that fire..." Ezra didn't need to hear the rest. He knew the truth. Together, they had survived. The days following the storm were filled with hard work and repairs. Ezra led the group in shoring up the roof, reinforcing the cabin's foundation, and clearing the path to the nearest stream. Despite the bitter cold and the damage, there was a renewed sense of purpose among them. Ezra had given them more than just warmth, he had given them hope. One morning, as Ezra repaired a broken section of the chimney, Clara approached him, a thoughtful look on her face. "Ezra," she began, "I've been thinking, we can't stay here forever. We're too far from help, too isolated. There are others, families, down in the valley who might need your knowledge. That fire, it could save so many." Ezra paused, wiping the sweat from his brow, and looked at her. The idea struck him like a sudden revelation. He had never thought beyond the four walls of his cabin, but now, standing there with Clara's words hanging in the cold air, he realized she was right. The fire wasn't just his secret, it was a gift. He nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time I shared this with others." With that, a new chapter began for Ezra Cole. One that stretched beyond survival. He had found something worth giving. And perhaps, in sharing it, he would finally find the community he had long avoided. The days turned into weeks, and the cabin, once a solitary refuge, began to hum with a newfound energy. Ezra had never imagined that something as simple as a fire trick could change the course of his life, but now, with Clara, Jacob, and Thomas by his side, it felt as though his world had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. The winter, with its bitter chill and relentless storms, seemed less threatening. Together, they had made it through the worst, and now the fire that had been their lifeline was beginning to take on a life of its own. Clara had been right about the need to share their knowledge, but the idea of leaving the quiet, isolated mountains was a hard one for Ezra. He had always preferred the solitude of the wilderness, the silence that allowed him to think, to reflect, to survive. But Clara's words had struck a chord deep within him. The fire had kept them safe, had saved them, and if it could help others in the valley, maybe it was time to step out of the shadows. Word spread quickly through the nearby settlements. A group of travelers, traders, and trappers, all those who had made their way across the treacherous mountain paths, spoke of a mountain man who had figured out how to keep his cabin warm through the harshest of winters. Soon, men and women alike came knocking at Ezra's door, seeking his wisdom. They weren't just interested in firewood or simple survival techniques. They wanted to learn the secret that had kept Ezra and his companions safe. At first, Ezra was reluctant. He had spent most of his life alone in these mountains, avoiding the bustling, ever-growing settlements. But with each passing visitor, he realized how much of a difference this small act of sharing could make. The first time he allowed a stranger into his cabin to learn about the fire, Ezra was nervous. His cabin, once a private sanctuary, was now a classroom. It was strange to have someone else standing where only Clara, Jacob, and Thomas had stood. But as he explained the delicate process of arranging the logs and controlling the airflow, he saw the spark of understanding in the stranger's eyes. Ezra realized then that he had more to give than just the warmth of the fire. He could offer them the tools to survive, to thrive. As the weeks wore on, Ezra's cabin became a place of gathering. Trappers would stop by to learn his technique, and in return, they would share their knowledge about new traps, better ways to hunt, even news of the world beyond the mountains. Ezra's quiet existence was slowly becoming a thing of the past, but instead of feeling the loss, he found himself embracing the change. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about creating a legacy. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to emerge, Ezra sat by the fire, the warmth comforting him as it always had. Clara sat beside him, a soft smile on her face. She could see the change in him, the way he had softened, the way he had begun to accept the idea of community. "I think we've created something special here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ezra looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, before a slow smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe we have." Spring arrived in the Appalachian Mountains, soft and hesitant at first, like a breath held too long. The snow melted, and the mountain streams began to fill again with the rush of water. The days grew longer, the air warmer, and for the first time in years Ezra could feel the weight of the winter lifting. But even as the earth thawed, the fire continued to burn in the hearts of those who had learned Ezra's trick. The fire, once a symbol of isolation and self-sufficiency, had become a beacon not just for survival, but for connection. The cabins across the valley, once simple shelters, now stood as strongholds of warmth, their fires burning longer and more steadily than ever before. Ezra's method had become something of a tradition passed from one family to the next. Those who had learned from him shared the knowledge, teaching their children, their neighbors, and their friends. Ezra had become more than just a mountain man. He had become a symbol of resilience, a man who had turned the harshest elements of nature into a partner, not an enemy. He no longer lived in the shadows of the wilderness. He had stepped into the light, and with it, a new understanding of what it meant to be a part of something larger than oneself. One day, as he walked along the trail to his cabin, Ezra encountered a familiar face, Jacob, who had stayed behind after the winter to help in the valley. His face was weathered, but his eyes were brighter than they had been months ago. "Ezra," Jacob called out, catching up to him. "I've been thinking. We've heard stories. People are coming from all around, trying to learn from you, I think. I think it's time for you to move on. Go to a bigger place. You've taught us all you can here. It's time for you to show the world what you've done." Ezra stopped, his hand resting on the worn handle of his rifle. He had heard the whispers about towns and communities growing bigger, places where his fire could do more than just keep a few families warm. But the thought of leaving the mountains, of leaving the life he had built here, unsettled him. "I'm not sure," Ezra said quietly, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "I've spent so many years here, in the quiet. I'm not sure I'm ready to leave all that behind." Jacob placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not about leaving what you've built, Ezra. It's about giving it the chance to grow." Ezra looked out across the mountains, the place that had been his home for so long. It was a hard place, unforgiving, but it had shaped him into the man he was. Now, perhaps it was time to share that strength, that knowledge, with others. With a deep breath, Ezra nodded. "Maybe it's time," he said, a small smile forming on his face. "Maybe it's time to let the fire spread." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting a warm golden light over the valley, Ezra knew that his journey was far from over. The fire he had nurtured, both the one that had kept him alive and the one that had lit a path for others, would continue to burn brightly, long after he was gone. It had become more than just a tool, it was a legacy. And as the fire spread, so too would the lessons it carried. That survival was not just about enduring, but about sharing, connecting, and growing together.